Clara Whitfield's hands trembled as the stagecoach lurched to a stop in Fort Kestrel, Montana, 1876, the edge of civilization, and possibly the edge of her sanity. She'd traded everything for a husband she'd never met, a rancher the townsfolk whispered was cold as January stone. But when Dawson Hale stepped forward, his weathered face softening at the sight of her terror, he didn't bark orders or inspect her like livestock. Instead, he simply said, "Let's get you home before the storm hits. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The stagecoach wheels groaned to a halt, kicking up a cloud of Montana dust that coated Clara's already gritty traveling dress. Through the smudged window, she could see the crude wooden buildings of Fort Kestrel lining a single dirt road, more of a wide path, really, that looked like it might wash away with the next hard rain. This was it, the place she'd gambled her entire future on. The place where a man she'd never laid eyes on waited to claim her as his bride. Clara pressed her gloved hand against her churning stomach and forced herself to breathe. The corseted bodice she'd worn for 3 days straight felt like an iron cage, and the August heat pressing through the coach's thin walls made her dizzy. Or maybe that was just terror. "Fort Kestrel," the driver shouted, his voice rough from days of trail dust. "Last stop, folks. If this ain't where you're meant to be, you sure as hell better speak up now." Clara wasn't entirely certain this was where she was meant to be, but she had nowhere else to go. Philadelphia was a month and 1,000 miles behind her. Her father's debts, his death, her stepmother's cold insistence that Clara was now a burden the household couldn't afford, all of that was sealed away like a tomb she'd never reopen. The mail-order bride arrangement had seemed like Providence when she'd first read the advertisement in the Philadelphia Ledger. "Widowed rancher seeks respectable woman for marriage. Must be of sound character and willing to embrace frontier life. Montana Territory. Reply to Dawson Hale, Fort Kestrel." It had been simple. Painfully. Almost insultingly simple. No flowery language about love or companionship. Just a transaction spelled out in ink and desperation. Claire had written back that same evening. Within 2 weeks, she'd received his reply. A short letter, carefully penned, agreeing to the arrangement and enclosing travel funds. He'd written almost nothing about himself, except that he owned a cattle ranch called Hale's Glen, that he was 34 years old, and that he expected her to arrive by late summer. She'd tried to convince herself it was romantic in a strange, frontier sort of way. But then the whispers started. Her boarding house neighbor in Omaha, where Clara had stopped to rest during her journey west, had paled when Clara mentioned Fort Kestrel. "You're not going to marry Dawson Hale, are you?" the woman had asked, her eyes going wide. "Yes," Clara had answered, her stomach already sinking. "Why? Do you know him?" "I know of him. My cousin used to freight supplies out that way. Said Hale's a hard man, cold. Lost his first wife in childbirth and never quite came back from it. Works his ranch hands near to death and barely speaks a word to anyone. Some say he's cruel. Others just say he's empty." Clara hadn't slept that night. She'd lain awake in the narrow boarding house bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling and wondering if she was traveling toward marriage or toward a slow, isolated death. But what choice did she have? Her stepmother had made it clear. There was no room for Clara in Philadelphia, not unless she wanted to end up in a factory, or worse. At least in Montana, Clara would have a roof over her head. At least she'd be someone's wife, even if that someone was a cruel, empty man who saw her as nothing more than a replacement for what he'd lost. The stagecoach door swung open, and the driver's weathered face appeared. "Miss Whitfield, this is your stop, ma'am." Clara's heart hammered so hard she was certain everyone within 10 feet could hear it. She smoothed her traveling dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been her Sunday best, and reached for the small carpet bag that held everything she owned in this world: 2 extra dresses, undergarments, a Bible her mother had given her before she died, and a single daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The driver helped her down, his grip firm but perfunctory. The moment her boots touched Montana soil, Clara felt the full weight of what she'd done. There was no turning back now, even if she wanted to flee. She had exactly 73 cents to her name and no means of getting anywhere. The street, if you could call it that, was nearly empty in the late afternoon heat. A few rough-looking men loitered outside what appeared to be a saloon, their eyes tracking her with an interest that made her skin crawl. A woman in a faded calico dress swept the boardwalk in front of a general store, pausing to stare at Clara with open curiosity. "Your trunk's on top," the driver said, already climbing back up to the luggage rack. "Where do you want it?" Clara opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, a deep voice cut through the dusty air. "I'll take it." She turned, and there he was. Dawson Hale was tall, taller than Clara had imagined, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his work shirt. His face was tanned and weathered, carved with lines that spoke of years under the brutal Montana sun. Dark hair, streaked with premature gray at the temples, curled slightly beneath the brim of his worn hat. His eyes, when they met hers, were the color of storm clouds, gray-blue and utterly unreadable. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. This was him. This was the man she'd promised to marry. The man who might be cruel, might be empty, might be everything the whispers had warned her about. But as Clara searched his face for signs of the harshness she'd been told to expect, she found herself uncertain. Yes, his expression was reserved, almost guarded, but there was something in the way he stood there, hat in his hands now, waiting for her to speak first, that didn't quite match the monster from her fears. "Miss Whitfield?" he said finally, his voice low and careful. "I'm Dawson Hale." Clara's throat had gone dry as old leather. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Your journey? Was it tolerable?" "Yes," Clara managed, though it was a lie. The journey had been grueling, terrifying, and lonelier than she'd thought possible. "Thank you for asking." Dawson nodded once, then turned to the stagecoach driver, who had wrestled Clara's battered trunk to the edge of the luggage rack. "I've got it from here, Mac." "You sure, Hale? This thing's heavier than it looks." "I'm sure." Without visible effort, Dawson lifted Clara's trunk, which contained her entire life packed into wood and brass hinges, and settled it on his shoulder. He didn't grunt, didn't strain, just bore the weight as if it were nothing at all. "My wagon's just there," he said, gesturing with his free hand toward a sturdy-looking buckboard hitched to 2 horses. "We should get moving. There's weather coming." Clara glanced at the sky. It was still bright blue, dotted with only a few harmless-looking clouds. "Weather?" "Storm," Dawson said shortly. He was already walking toward the wagon, her trunk balanced on his shoulder. "You learn to read the signs out here. We've got maybe 2 hours before it hits." Clara hurried after him, her skirts kicking up little puffs of dust. The men outside the saloon were definitely staring now, their conversation dying away as she passed. She caught a few muttered words, Hale's bride, and pretty little thing, and something else she was glad she couldn't quite make out. Dawson loaded her trunk into the wagon bed with surprising care, securing it with rope so it wouldn't shift during the ride. Then he turned to Clara, and for the first time she saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty, maybe, or concern. "It's about an hour's ride to the ranch," he said. "The road's rough in places. If you need to stop for any reason, you just say so." Clara nodded, struck by the gentleness in his tone. This wasn't how a cruel man spoke. Was it? He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand steady under her elbow, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses started forward at his quiet command, and just like that, Clara was leaving Fort Kestrel behind. They rode in silence for the first 10 minutes, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady clip-clop of hooves on packed earth. The landscape opened up around them, rolling hills covered in golden grass, stands of pine trees dark against the distant mountains, sky so huge it seemed to swallow everything beneath it. It was beautiful. Clara hadn't expected that. She'd imagined Montana as a harsh, unforgiving place, all rocks and desolation. But this was something else entirely. Wild, yes. Untamed, but there was a kind of terrible beauty to it that made her chest ache. "First time this far west?" Dawson asked, breaking the silence. Clara jumped slightly at his voice. "Yes, I've never been past Ohio before this." He nodded, his eyes on the road ahead. "It's different out here. Takes some getting used to." "So I'm learning." Another stretch of silence fell between them, but it felt less awkward this time. Clara studied him from the corner of her eye, trying to reconcile the man beside her with the warnings she'd received. He sat relaxed in the seat, reins held loosely in his capable hands, his profile calm and focused. There was nothing threatening about him. If anything, he seemed tired, sad, maybe. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said before she could lose her nerve. Dawson glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "I suppose that's your right, seeing as we're about to be married." The bluntness of it made Clara's cheeks burn, but she pressed on. Why did you want a mail-order bride, if you don't mind my asking?" For a long moment she thought he wasn't going to answer. His jaw tightened and his gaze returned to the road. Then quietly, "The house is too quiet." Clara waited, sensing there was more. "My first wife, Anne," Dawson continued, his voice carefully controlled, "she died 3 years ago, childbirth. The baby didn't make it either. After that, He paused, seeming to search for words. "I managed, kept the ranch going, kept myself busy, but the silence, it started to feel like it was eating me alive. I don't need someone to cook and clean, Miss Whitfield. I can do those things myself. What I need is someone who'll stay, someone who'll make the house feel like it's not a tomb." The raw honesty of it stole Clara's breath. This wasn't a cruel man. This was a man who'd been hollowed out by grief and was trying, in the only way he knew how, to fill the empty spaces. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly, "about your wife and your child." Dawson nodded once, accepting her condolence without comment. Then, surprising her, he asked, "What about you? Why did you answer my advertisement?" Clara's hands twisted in her lap. She should probably lie, or at least soften the truth. But something about Dawson's honesty demanded the same in return. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," she admitted. "My father died 6 months ago, drowning in debts. My stepmother made it clear I was a burden. When I saw your advertisement, it seemed like maybe Providence, a chance to start over." "And you weren't afraid?" Dawson asked, "coming all this way to marry a stranger?" "I was terrified," Clara said, with a shaky laugh. "I still am, if I'm being honest." Dawson was quiet for a moment. Then, "I won't hurt you, Miss Whitfield. I want you to know that. Whatever you might have heard about me in town, and I'm guessing you heard something given how pale you went when you first saw me, I'm not a cruel man. I'm just not good at this, at talking, at being around people. But I won't hurt you." The sincerity in his voice made Clara's eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." They rode on, the silence between them now comfortable, almost companionable. The sun had started its descent toward the western mountains, painting the grasslands in shades of amber and gold. And true to Dawson's prediction, dark clouds were beginning to gather on the northern horizon, moving faster than Clara would have thought possible. "That's a storm," Dawson said, nodding toward the clouds. "We'll beat it home, but not by much." "Is your ranch very far?" "Just over that rise." He pointed toward a gentle hill crowned with pine trees. "Hale's Glen. It's not fancy, but it's solid. Good grazing land, fresh water from the creek. I built it up from nothing over the past 10 years. There was pride in his voice, quiet but unmistakable. This land meant something to him. It wasn't just a place to live. It was proof that he'd survived, that he'd built something lasting in this harsh country. As they crested the rise, Clara caught her first glimpse of what would be her new home. Hale's Glen spread across a wide valley, protected on 3 sides by rolling hills thick with pine. A creek glittered in the late afternoon sun, winding through pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. The ranch house itself was larger than Clara had expected, a solid timber structure with a covered porch running along the front, real glass windows, and a stone chimney rising from one end. Nearby stood a barn, corrals, and several smaller outbuildings, all well maintained and sturdy. It was beautiful. Remote, yes. Isolated, certainly, but beautiful in a way that made Clara's breath catch. "That's home," Dawson said simply. Then, with a glance at her face, "What do you think?" "It's lovely," Clara said honestly, "much more than I expected." Something that might have been relief flickered across Dawson's features. "Good. I'm glad. As they descended into the valley, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and pine. The clouds were moving faster now, dark and heavy with the promise of a storm. Dawson urged the horses to a quicker pace, and they rolled into the ranch yard just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. "Go on inside," Dawson said, jumping down from the wagon and reaching up to help Clara down. "Front door's unlocked. I need to get the horses settled and your trunk under cover." "I can help," Clara started, but Dawson shook his head. "You've been traveling for days. Go inside, get warm. There's a stove in the kitchen if you want to start a fire. I'll be in shortly." Clara wanted to argue, to prove that she wasn't some delicate creature who couldn't handle a little rain, but the exhaustion of her journey was catching up with her fast. She nodded and hurried toward the house as the rain began to fall in earnest. The front door opened easily under her hand, and Clara stepped into what would be her new home. The interior was dim after the bright afternoon outside, but as her eyes adjusted, Clara found herself standing in a spacious main room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel bare of decoration. Simple furniture, a sofa, 2 chairs, a sturdy table, filled the space, everything clean but austere. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the plank floor, no personal touches anywhere. It was exactly what Dawson had described, a house, not a home. Clara moved deeper into the room, her wet skirts leaving damp footprints on the floor. To her left, an open doorway led to what appeared to be a kitchen. To her right, a narrow staircase climbed to the second floor. Everything was well built and functional, but there was a coldness to it, an emptiness that had nothing to do with temperature. This was what 3 years of grief looked like. A man living but not really alive, maintaining but not thriving, surviving but not healing. Thunder rumbled outside, and rain began to hammer against the roof. Clara moved to the kitchen, found matches on a shelf, and set about starting a fire in the cast-iron stove. The familiar task steadied her nerves. By the time Dawson came inside, dripping wet and carrying her trunk on his shoulder, the kitchen had started to warm, and Clara had found the coffee pot. "You didn't need to do that," Dawson said, setting her trunk down near the stairs. Water dripped from his hair, running in rivulets down his face. "I wanted to help," Clara said. "And you're soaked. You should change before you catch cold." Dawson looked down at himself as if just noticing his drenched state. "I suppose you're right." He hesitated, then said, "I'll show you your room first. Get you settled." "Your room, not our room." Clara felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly buckled her knees. Whatever else Dawson Hale might be, he wasn't going to force himself on her. Not tonight. Maybe not ever, if she didn't want it. He lifted her trunk again and headed for the stairs. Clara followed, her exhaustion making each step feel like climbing a mountain. The second floor consisted of a narrow hallway with 3 doors. Dawson stopped at the first one. This was going to be the nursery," he said quietly. "But I never finished it. It's empty now. The room at the end of the hall is mine. This middle one," he pushed open the door, "is yours, for now. For as long as you need it." The room was small but clean, with a real bed, a wardrobe, a washstand, and a window overlooking the valley. Like the rest of the house, it was bare of any personal touches, but the bed had clean sheets, and someone, Dawson, Clara realized, had placed a vase of wildflowers on the windowsill. That single gesture, so small and thoughtful, made Clara's throat tighten with emotion. "It's perfect," she said. "Thank you." Dawson set her trunk at the foot of the bed, then stood there awkwardly, water still dripping from his clothes. "There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up. Clean towels in the wardrobe. I'll leave you to rest." But he was backing toward the door when Clara found her voice. "Dawson?" He stopped, turning back. "Yes?" "The flowers," Clara said, gesturing to the windowsill. "Did you pick them?" A flush crept up his neck, visible even in the dim light. I wanted the room to feel welcoming. Anne always said a house needs flowers to feel like a home." Clara's heart clenched. Here was this gruff, grieving man trying so hard to make her feel wanted, to make this house feel like something more than a silent tomb. How could anyone think him cruel? "They're beautiful," Clara said softly. "Thank you." Dawson nodded once, then retreated, pulling the door shut behind him with a quiet click. Alone for the first time in days, Clara sank onto the edge of the bed and let out a long, shaky breath. Outside, the storm raged, wind howling around the corners of the house and rain hammering the roof like a drumbeat. But inside, in this small room with its wildflowers and clean sheets, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in months. Safe. She didn't know what the future held. Didn't know if she and Dawson would ever truly be husband and wife in more than name. Didn't know if she could make a life here in this vast, lonely country. But for the first time since she'd stepped onto that stagecoach in Philadelphia, Clara thought maybe, just maybe, she hadn't made a terrible mistake after all. Maybe Providence had led her here for a reason. Maybe this quiet, grieving man with his empty house and his wildflowers was exactly where she was supposed to be. The storm raged on through the night, but Clara barely heard it. Exhausted beyond measure, she changed into her nightgown, crawled beneath the clean quilts, and fell into the deepest sleep she'd had in months. When she woke the next morning to pale sunlight streaming through her window and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen, Clara Whitfield knew one thing for certain. Her new life had begun, and whatever came next, she would face it with courage. Even if that courage sometimes looked a lot like desperate hope. But hope, Clara was learning, was its own kind of strength. And in this wild Montana country, with a man who spoke softly and picked wildflowers for a stranger's room, hope might just be enough. The morning sun had burned away the last traces of storm clouds by the time Clara descended the stairs, her hair hastily pinned and her second-best dress smoothed as neatly as exhaustion would allow. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, and for a moment Clara wondered if Dawson had already left for the day's work. But then she heard the soft clink of a cup being set down, and she found him in the kitchen, standing by the stove with a coffee pot in hand. He'd changed into dry clothes, dark trousers, a simple cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his hair was still damp from what must have been a quick wash. When he heard her footsteps, he turned, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or uncertainty. "Morning," he said. "I wasn't sure what time you'd wake. There's coffee, and I can make breakfast if you're hungry." Clara blinked, momentarily thrown by the offer. "You cook?" A ghost of a smile touched Dawson's mouth. 3 years of living alone teaches a man a few things. I won't claim it's fancy, but it's edible. "I can cook," Clara said quickly, moving toward the stove. "Please, let me. It's the least I can do after—" "Miss Whitfield." Dawson's voice was gentle but firm. He set the coffee pot down and turned to face her fully. "I didn't bring you here to be my cook and housekeeper. I meant what I said yesterday. I can manage those things myself. What I need is company. Someone who'll make this place feel less like a mausoleum." The word hung in the air between them, stark and honest. Clara's hands twisted in her skirts, her mind racing. She'd spent the entire journey west preparing herself to be useful, to earn her keep through labor and service. The idea that Dawson wanted something else entirely, something as simple and complicated as presence, left her feeling unmoored. "I don't know how to just be here," she admitted quietly. "I need to do something. Otherwise I'll feel like a burden." Dawson studied her for a long moment, his gray-blue eyes thoughtful. Then he nodded, as if coming to some internal decision. "All right, how about this? We share the work. I'm not asking you to be idle, but I'm also not asking you to wait on me hand and foot. We're partners in this arrangement, equals. Does that sit better with you?" Partners, equals. The words were so foreign to everything Clara had been taught about marriage that she almost laughed. But Dawson's expression was completely serious, even earnest. "Yes," Clara said. "That sits better." "Good." Dawson handed her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "Then let's start with breakfast. I'll slice the bacon if you'll handle the eggs and biscuits." They worked together in the small kitchen, moving around each other with the awkwardness of strangers learning a new dance. Clara found the flour and lard, mixed biscuit dough with practiced efficiency, and set them to bake while Dawson fried bacon in a cast-iron skillet. The domestic normalcy of it was surreal. Here she was, in the Montana wilderness, making breakfast with a man she'd known for less than 12 hours, a man she was supposed to marry. "When did you want to—" Clara trailed off. not quite sure how to phrase the question. That is, when should we... The ceremony? Get married? Dawson finished for her. He flipped a strip of bacon, not looking at her. I thought we'd give it a week or so. Let you settle in, get your bearings, judge whether you want to go through with it. Clara's hand stilled over the egg she'd been cracking. You'd let me back out? If you wanted to, yes. Dawson's voice was quiet but steady. I won't trap you here, Miss Whitfield. If you decide this isn't the life you want, I'll pay your passage back east. No questions asked. The offer should have been reassuring. Instead, it made Clara's chest ache with an emotion she couldn't quite name. This man, this supposedly cruel, empty man, was giving her an escape route, even though it would cost him money he'd already spent and leave him alone again in his too-quiet house. That's very generous, Clara said softly, but I don't think I'll need it. I made a promise, and I intend to keep it. Dawson glanced at her then, something warm flickering in his eyes. We'll see how you feel after a week of Montana living. It's not Philadelphia out here. They ate breakfast at the kitchen table, the meal punctuated by long silences that gradually became less uncomfortable. Dawson had been right. His cooking was simple but good, and Clara's biscuits had turned out better than she'd hoped despite the unfamiliar stove. When they'd finished, Dawson pushed back from the table and stood. I need to check on the cattle, make sure none of them got into trouble during the storm. There's 2 ranch hands, Joe and Pete, who live in the bunkhouse and help with the heavy work. Good men, both of them, but they keep to themselves mostly. You probably won't see much of them. He paused, then added, You're welcome to come with me if you want. See the ranch. Or you can stay here, explore the house, rest some more. Whatever you prefer. Clara stood as well, decision made. I'd like to come. If I'm going to live here, I should understand how everything works. Dawson nodded, approval clear on his face. Fair enough. You'll want to change into something you don't mind getting dusty, and find some sturdy shoes if you've got them. 20 minutes later, Clara had traded her good dress for her oldest calico and her worn traveling boots. When she came back downstairs, Dawson was waiting on the porch, 2 horses already saddled and ready. Clara's stomach dropped. I should probably mention that I've never ridden a horse before. Dawson blinked, clearly surprised. Never? There wasn't much call for it in Philadelphia. I've ridden in carriages, but actually on a horse. No. For a moment, Dawson looked uncertain, like he was trying to solve a particularly complicated problem. Then his expression cleared. All right, you'll ride with me then, at least until we can teach you properly. Before Clara could protest or panic, Dawson mounted his horse in one fluid motion, then reached down to her. Put your foot on mine and give me your hand. I'll pull you up. Clara hesitated only a moment before doing as he instructed. Dawson's hand was warm and calloused against hers, his grip firm as he lifted her with startling ease. She found herself seated sideways in front of him, acutely aware of his arms circling her waist to hold the reins. Comfortable enough? He asked, his voice close to her ear. Comfortable was not the word Clara would have chosen. Terrified, overwhelmed, hyper-aware of every point where their bodies touched, those were more accurate. But she managed a nod. Good. Hold on. They started forward at an easy walk, the other horse trailing behind on a lead rope. As they moved away from the house and deeper into the ranch lands, Clara began to relax despite herself. The morning was beautiful, the air washed clean by the storm and scented with pine and sage. Meadowlarks sang from fence posts, and in the distance cattle grazed peacefully in pastures still damp with dew. That's the north pasture, Dawson said, pointing with his free hand. About 300 head of cattle up there. The creek runs through it, so there's always water. South pasture is smaller, mostly where we keep the horses and a few milk cows. The east section is where we cut hay for winter feed. He spoke with quiet pride, describing fence lines and grazing rotation, water rights, and winter preparations. Clara listened, trying to absorb the sheer scope of what Dawson had built here. This wasn't just a ranch. It was an entire world, complex and carefully balanced, wrested from wild land through years of backbreaking work. How long have you been here? She asked. 10 years come September. Bought the land with money I'd saved from working cattle drives down in Texas. Wasn't much here then, just open range and a few falling down claim shanties. Built the house the first year, the barn the second. added on bit by bit as I could afford it. And your wife? Anne? Did She came the third year, Dawson said, his voice carefully neutral. Met her in Fort Kestrel. She was a school teacher, come west with a church mission group. We courted for 6 months before I asked her to marry me. Clara heard what he didn't say, that Anne had chosen him, had known him before saying yes, had come to this ranch as more than a desperate stranger with nowhere else to go. The comparison stung more than Clara wanted to admit. She must have loved it here, Clara offered carefully. Dawson was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. Then, she tried to. Anne was a town girl like you. The isolation was hard on her. She missed having neighbors, missed teaching, missed the social life she'd had back east. But she tried. Right up until the end, she tried. The grief in his voice was a living thing, raw despite 3 years of distance. Clara's heart clenched with sympathy and with a sudden, uncomfortable understanding of why Dawson had advertised for a mail-order bride. He'd loved Anne, lost her, and couldn't bear to risk that kind of connection again. Better to arrange a practical partnership with a stranger than to open himself up to that kind of devastation a second time. They rode in silence for a while, crossing into the north pasture where cattle lifted their heads to watch them pass. Dawson checked fence lines and water sources with a practiced eye, occasionally pointing out details Clara would need to know, which bulls were aggressive and should be avoided, where the best fishing spots on the creek were, which areas were prone to flooding and heavy rain. They were riding along a ridge that overlooked the entire valley when they encountered the first ranch hand. He was a weathered man of perhaps 50, lean and bow-legged from a lifetime on horseback, and he touched his hat brim when he saw them approach. "Morning, boss, ma'am." "Morning, Joe," Dawson said. "Any trouble from the storm?" "Lost a few fence posts down by the creek crossing. Pete's working on them now. Otherwise, everything held up fine." Joe's eyes were frankly curious as they rested on Clara. "This the lady you were expecting?" "This is Miss Clara Whitfield," Dawson said. "She'll be staying on as my wife once we're properly married. Clara, this is Joe Brennan. He's been with the ranch since the beginning." Clara managed a smile despite her embarrassment at being discussed like a new piece of equipment. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Brennan." "Just Joe, ma'am, and likewise." He turned back to Dawson. "I'll let you two get on with your tour. Pete and I will have those fence posts replaced by supper time." They parted ways, and Clara felt Dawson's arm tighten slightly around her waist as they continued riding. "Joe's a good man," he said, "a little rough around the edges, but honest and hard-working. Pete's younger, maybe 25, but he knows cattle and horses better than anyone I've ever met. Between the three of us, we keep things running." "Only 3 of you?" Clara couldn't hide her surprise. "For all this land?" "It's enough for now. During roundup and branding, I hire on a few extra hands from town. But for day-to-day work, 3 is plenty." Dawson paused. "It won't be easy work, Clara. I know I said I don't need a servant, and I meant it. But ranch life means long days and hard labor for everyone. If you're willing, there's plenty you can help with. The garden, the chickens, preserving food for winter. Nothing I'll force on you, but it all needs doing." "I want to help," Clara said firmly. "I told you, I can't just be idle. Show me what needs doing, and I'll do it." Something in Dawson's posture relaxed, as if her answer had relieved some worry he'd been carrying. "All right then, let's head back to the house. I'll show you the garden and the chicken coop, see what you think." The ride back was easier, Clara's fear of the horse gradually giving way to a cautious enjoyment of the swaying motion and the warmth of the sun on her face. When they reached the ranch yard, Dawson helped her down, his hand steady at her waist, and led her around the side of the house to what had once been a substantial vegetable garden. Clara's heart sank at the sight. The plot was overrun with weeds, the soil hard and neglected, only a few struggling plants visible among the chaos. A broken fence tilted at a drunken angle, and what might once have been neat rows had devolved into wilderness. "Anne planted this the first spring she was here," Dawson said quietly. "After she died, I couldn't tend it. Couldn't even look at it most days. It's gone to ruin, I know. But the soil's good, and the location gets plenty of sun. If you wanted to reclaim it, I'd help you. We could have it productive again by next growing season." Clara stared at the neglected garden, seeing not just weeds and broken fence posts, but a symbol of everything Dawson had described: the house too quiet, the life drained away, the careful maintenance of things that kept a body alive but not a soul. This garden had been Anne's, and Dawson, in his grief, had let it die because tending it would have meant admitting she was gone. But Clara wasn't Anne. And maybe, just maybe, this garden could be something new, not a replacement, but a fresh start. "I'd like that," Clara said. "I'd like to bring it back." Dawson's expression softened with unmistakable relief. "Good. We'll start tomorrow if the weather holds." The chicken coop was in better shape. Dawson admitted he'd maintained it out of necessity, needing the eggs. But it was clear he'd done only the bare minimum. The hens were healthy but skittish, and the coop itself needed fresh straw and a good cleaning. "I can handle this," Clara said, already mentally cataloging what would be needed. "If you can show me where you keep the feed and supplies." They spent the rest of the morning with Dawson giving Clara a thorough tour of the outbuildings and storage areas, showing her where everything was kept and explaining the daily routines that kept the ranch functioning. By the time they returned to the house for the midday meal, Claire's head was swimming with information, but she felt more settled than she had since leaving Philadelphia. This was real. This was a life she could build, piece by piece, row by row, in a reclaimed garden. Over the next week, Clara threw herself into learning the rhythms of Hale's Glen. She rose with the sun, helped Dawson with breakfast, then spent her days tackling the chicken coop, beginning the slow process of clearing the garden and familiarizing herself with the house itself. In the evenings, after the work was done and supper cleared away, she and Dawson would sit on the porch, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and pink. Those evening conversations became the foundation of something Clara hadn't expected: friendship. Dawson, she discovered, was not naturally talkative, but when he did speak, it was worth listening to. He told her about the land, about the cattle, about the harsh Montana winters and the brief blazing summers. He spoke carefully of Anne, sharing small memories that helped Clara understand the woman who'd lived here before her. And slowly, hesitantly, he began to ask Clara about her own life, about Philadelphia, about her parents, about the circumstances that had driven her west. "My father was a good man," Clara said one evening, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. "But he was terrible with money. He invested in a shipping venture that failed, then tried to recoup the losses with a series of increasingly desperate business schemes. When he died, we found out he'd mortgaged everything, even things that didn't belong to him. My stepmother, his second wife, decided the quickest solution was to marry me off to one of her nephew's friends, a man 3 times my age with a reputation for cruelty to his servants." Dawson's hands tightened on the porch railing. "So you ran." "So I found your advertisement and chose a different unknown," Clara said. "At least here, I'm choosing my own fate." "And is it what you expected?" Dawson asked. "This life?" Clara considered the question seriously. Was it what she'd expected? No, she'd expected harshness, cruelty, a cold transaction. What she'd found instead was a lonely man trying to heal, a beautiful valley that felt like the edge of the world, and work that left her exhausted but strangely satisfied. "It's better," she said finally. "Different, but better." Dawson turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "I'm glad. I worried I'd be disappointing you, that the reality wouldn't match whatever you'd imagined." "I think we both worried about that," Clara admitted. "I was terrified you'd be the monster the rumors suggested." "What rumors?" Dawson's voice had gone carefully neutral. Clara hesitated, then decided honesty was better than evasion. "In Omaha, a woman told me you were cold, cruel, that you worked your hands near to death and never spoke to anyone. She said losing your wife had emptied you out." Dawson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "The cold part's probably true enough, and I won't deny I kept to myself after Anne died. But cruel? No. Never that." "I know," Clara said softly. "I knew it the moment you picked wildflowers for my room." Something passed between them then, a wordless understanding that felt like the tentative beginning of trust. They sat together as full darkness fell, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, crickets singing in the grass, the soft hoot of an owl somewhere in the pines. Clara? Dawson's use of her first name sent a small thrill through her. He'd been calling her Miss Whitfield all week. I was thinking, if you're still willing, we could go into Fort Kestrel on Saturday. See the preacher. Make it official. But only if you're ready. There's no rush. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment of commitment. The point of no return. She could still back out, could take Dawson up on his offer to send her back east. But as she sat there in the darkness beside this quiet man who'd been nothing but gentle and patient with her, Clara realized she didn't want to leave. "I'm ready," she said. "Saturday is fine." She felt rather than saw Dawson's nod. "All right then, Saturday it is." The days leading up to their wedding passed in a blur of nervous energy and hard work. Clara attacked the garden with renewed determination, clearing weeds and turning soil until her hands blistered despite the gloves Dawson insisted she wear. The chicken coop gleamed with fresh straw and new nesting boxes Dawson built in his spare time. The house itself began to show signs of habitation, curtains Clara sewed from fabric. Dawson brought back from town a tablecloth embroidered with simple flowers, a rug placed near the hearth to soften the bare floors. Small changes, but significant ones. The house was beginning to breathe again. On Friday evening, Clara was in the kitchen kneading bread dough when Dawson came in from the barn, his expression troubled. "Everything all right?" Clara asked, wiping flour from her hands. "Joe brought news from town," Dawson said, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Seems Silas Marbury's been asking questions about the ranch, about me, about you." "Who's Silas Marbury?" "The banker in Fort Kestrel. He's been after me to sell the North Pasture for the better part of 2 years now. Says the railroad wants to run a spur line through it, and he can broker a deal that'll make everyone rich." Dawson's jaw tightened. "I told him no. That land has the best grazing and the most reliable water. Selling it would cripple the ranch." Clara felt a chill of unease. "And now he's asking about us?" "About you specifically. Wanting to know if the marriage is legitimate, if you're really who you say you are, if I'm paying you to pretend." Dawson's voice was tight with anger. "He's looking for an angle, some way to discredit me or make trouble. Marbury's a powerful man in Fort Kestrel, and he's used to getting what he wants." "Can he actually cause problems for us?" Clara asked. "He can try. And he's got connections. Territorial judge is his cousin. Half the town businesses owe him money. If he wanted to make our lives difficult, he could." Dawson met her eyes. "I'm sorry, Clara. I didn't think about how my refusal to sell might affect you. If you want to wait on the wedding, I'd understand." "No." Clara's voice was firm. "We're not letting some greedy banker dictate our lives. If anything, this makes me more determined to go through with it. I won't let him think he can intimidate us." Dawson's expression softened with what looked like pride. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. Tomorrow we get married, and Mr. Marbury can choke on his railroad spur line." Despite her brave words, Clara barely slept that night. She lay in her small room listening to the house settle, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong. What if Dawson regretted this? What if she couldn't adapt to ranch life? What if Silas Marbury found a way to destroy everything they were trying to build? But when morning came and Clara descended the stairs to find Dawson already up, freshly shaved and wearing what was clearly his best shirt, her doubts quieted. This was right. It might be unconventional, might be born of loneliness and desperation rather than romance, but it was right. They rode to Fort Kestrel side by side, Clara on the gentler of the two horses, under Dawson's patient instruction. She'd spent the past week learning to ride, and while she was far from confident, she could at least stay in the saddle at a walk. The town was busier than it had been when Clara first arrived, the single main street crowded with wagons and horses. Curious eyes tracked their progress as Dawson led them to a small white church at the far end of the town. Reverend Michaels was a kind-faced man in his 60s who greeted them warmly and asked no uncomfortable questions. His wife served as witness, and the ceremony itself was brief and simple. Clara repeated her vows in a voice that shook only slightly, and Dawson's voice was steady and sure as he promised to honor and protect her. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Dawson leaned in and pressed a chaste kiss to Clara's forehead, gentle, respectful, nothing that would frighten her. But his hand found hers and squeezed, a silent acknowledgement of the commitment they'd just made. They were leaving the church when a voice called out behind them. Hale? A word, if you don't mind. Clara turned to see a well-dressed man approaching, his suit expensive and his boots polished to a high shine. He was perhaps 45, with graying temples and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Marbury, Dawson said, his voice carefully neutral. I'm afraid we're in a bit of a hurry. This won't take but a moment. Silas Marbury's gaze slid to Clara, assessing and cold. I wanted to congratulate you on your marriage. And to meet your bride, of course. Mrs. Hale, is it now? It is, Clara said, lifting her chin despite the knot of fear in her stomach. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Marbury? The pleasure is mine, I assure you. Marbury's smile widened, showing too many teeth. It's quite romantic, isn't it? A mail-order bride traveling all this way to marry a man she's never met. One does wonder what desperate circumstances would drive a woman to such lengths. The insult was thinly veiled, and Clara felt Dawson tense beside her. But before he could respond, Clara stepped forward. The same circumstances that drive anyone to seek a better life, Mr. Marbury. Courage, hope, and a willingness to work for what I want. You might try it sometime. For a moment, genuine surprise flickered across Marbury's face. Then his expression hardened. Charming. Hale, when you tire of playing house, my offer still stands. The railroad is coming whether you like it or not. You can either profit from it or be crushed by it. Then I suppose I'll be crushed, Dawson said quietly, because that land's not for sale. Not to you, not to the railroad, not to anyone. Marbury's eyes went cold as winter stone. We'll see about that. He tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness. Good day, Mrs. Hale. I suspect we'll be seeing quite a bit of each other in the coming months. He walked away, leaving a trail of unease in his wake. I'm sorry, Dawson said as they mounted their horses. That's exactly the kind of scene I'd hoped to avoid on your wedding day. Don't apologize, Clara said. You did nothing wrong, and neither did I. That man is a bully, and bullies need to be stood up to. Dawson looked at her with open admiration. You handled him better than I ever have. He's used to people backing down. Then it's past time someone didn't. Clara gathered her reins, surprised by her own boldness. A week ago, she would have been terrified to speak that way to a powerful man. But something about this place, about Dawson's quiet strength and the life they were building together, was changing her, making her braver. They rode home through the golden afternoon, and when they crested the final hill and saw Hale's Glen spread out below them, Clara felt a fierce surge of possession. This was hers now. Her home, her land, her life. And she'd be damned if she let Silas Marbury or anyone else take it away. That night, after a quiet wedding supper and evening chores, Clara and Dawson stood together on the porch, watching the stars emerge. Are you happy? Dawson asked suddenly. With how things turned out? Clara considered the question. Was she happy? It was too soon to say, but she was content and more hopeful than she'd been in months, and that was enough for now. I am, she said. Are you? Yes, Dawson said simply. Then, after a pause, your room is still yours, Clara. I won't ask you to. He trailed off, clearly struggling with the words. Clara felt her face heat. I appreciate that, but we are married now. And perhaps in time, Dawson agreed, relief evident in his voice. There's no rush. We'll figure it out as we go. They stood together in comfortable silence, bound now by law and by a growing respect that might someday become something deeper. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of possibility. And as Clara finally bid Dawson good night and climbed the stairs to her own room, her room in her house with her husband waiting patiently below, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm blanket. She'd come to Montana as a frightened girl with nowhere else to go, but she was becoming something different here, a woman with purpose, with a home to defend, with a partner who saw her as an equal. It was more than she'd ever dared hope for. And it was only the beginning. The weeks after the wedding settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Clara rose each morning before dawn to tend the chickens and start breakfast while Dawson handled the early barn chores. They'd eat together as the sun climbed over the eastern hills, their conversations growing easier with each passing day. Then Dawson would ride out to check the cattle or mend fences, and Clara would lose herself in the endless work of bringing the ranch back to life. The garden became her obsession. Every morning after Dawson left, she'd pull on her oldest dress and the leather gloves he'd bought her in town, and she'd attack the neglected plot with determination that bordered on fury. Each weed she yanked from the soil felt like a small victory. Each row she cleared a reclamation of something that had been lost. By mid-September, the garden showed the first real signs of recovery. Neat rows marked with stakes and string, soil turned and amended with manure from the barn, a small victory over the wilderness that had tried to swallow it whole. Dawson would come find her there in the evenings, his shadow falling long across the worked earth as he surveyed her progress. He never criticized, never suggested she was doing it wrong. Instead, he'd roll up his sleeves and help her finish whatever row she was working on, the two of them laboring side by side in comfortable silence until the fading light drove them inside. Those quiet moments of shared work were when Clara felt the distance between them shrinking. Not dramatically, not with any grand declarations, but in small increments that accumulated like coins in a jar. The way Dawson would steady her elbow when she climbed down from the wagon, the way Clara learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders and the line of his jaw. The way they'd started sitting closer together on the porch in the evenings, until the space between them was barely a hand's width. It was during one of those evenings, when autumn had begun to paint the aspens gold and the air carried a hint of the winter to come, that Clara first felt the flutter low in her belly that made her breath catch. She'd missed her monthly courses. Once could have been stress or the rigors of travel and adjustment. But twice? That was something else entirely. Clara pressed a hand to her stomach, her heart hammering as she did the calculations. 6 weeks since the wedding, 7 weeks since she'd arrived at Hales Glen. It was possible, more than possible. "You all right?" Dawson's voice broke through her thoughts. He was watching her with concern, a cup of coffee halfway to his lips. "You've gone pale." "I'm fine," Clara said quickly, dropping her hand. "Just tired, I think. It's been a long day." It wasn't a lie exactly. She was tired, bone-deep exhausted in a way that felt different from the satisfying weariness of hard work. But she couldn't tell Dawson about her suspicions. Not yet. Not until she was certain, and not until she figured out how she felt about it herself. Because the truth was, the possibility of carrying Dawson's child terrified her as much as it thrilled her. They were still learning each other, still navigating the strange territory between strangers and spouses. A child would change everything, would bind them together in ways that went far beyond legal documents and shared meals. And there was Anne to consider. Anne, who had died bringing Dawson's child into the world. Anne, whose loss still haunted every corner of this house. Clara excused herself early that night, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. As she lay in her bed, still her own bed in her own room, because despite being married, they'd maintained their careful distance, she let her hand rest on her still flat stomach and tried to imagine a future where she swelled with new life, where Dawson's careful reserve cracked open to make room for joy. It was a future she wanted, Clara realized with startling clarity. Wanted with an intensity that frightened her. But wanting and having were two very different things, especially in a place where childbirth could mean death and where the nearest doctor was a hard day's ride away. The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of smoke. Not the pleasant wood smoke of the kitchen stove, but something acrid and wrong. She threw on her wrapper and rushed downstairs to find Dawson already dressed, his face grim as he stared out the kitchen window. "What is it?" Clara asked, her stomach knotting with dread. "Grass fire. On the north ridge, right at the edge of our property line." Dawson's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Joe spotted it when he went out for the early check. It's not natural, Clara. Someone set it deliberately." Clara moved to the window and saw the thin column of smoke rising against the dawn sky. Even from this distance, she could see the orange glow at its base, could imagine the flames eating through the dry autumn grass. "Marbury," she breathed. "Can't prove it," Dawson said, already moving toward the door. "But yes, I'd bet my last dollar he's behind it. That fire's positioned to push toward our north pasture if the wind shifts. It's a warning, or an attempt to drive the cattle off the land, or both." He grabbed his hat from the hook. "I need to get up there with Joe and Pete, try to create a fire break before it spreads. You stay here. Keep watch on the house." "No." Clara's voice was firm. If you need to fight that fire, you need every available hand. Show me what to do. Dawson turned to her, clearly torn between practicality and the desire to keep her safe. Clara, it's dangerous. Everything out here is dangerous, Clara cut him off. Childbirth is dangerous. Winter is dangerous. Life is dangerous, Dawson. Now stop wasting time and tell me what I can do to help save our ranch. Something flickered in Dawson's eyes. Respect, maybe, or the beginning of something deeper. He nodded once, decision made. All right. Get dressed in your heaviest clothes, nothing that'll catch easy. Boots, gloves, a hat to cover your hair. We ride in 5 minutes. Clara had never moved faster in her life. She threw on her oldest dress, layered a heavy shawl over it, wrapped a scarf around her head, and was back downstairs before Dawson had finished loading supplies onto the wagon. They rode out together into the smoke-tinged dawn, Clara clinging to the wagon seat as Dawson pushed the horses to a pace that made her teeth rattle. The fire was worse up close. What had looked like a small blaze from the house revealed itself as a line of flames, perhaps 200 yards long, creeping steadily through the dry grass toward the fence line that marked Dawson's property. Joe and Pete were already there, frantically digging a fire break with shovels, their faces streaked with soot and sweat despite the morning chill. It jumped the creek about 20 minutes ago, Joe shouted over the crackle of flames. We're trying to clear enough grass to stop it, but we need more hands. Dawson jumped down from the wagon and grabbed a shovel, then thrust another into Clara's hands. Dig down to bare dirt, he instructed, his voice urgent. We need a strip at least 6 feet wide with nothing for the fire to catch on. Can you do that? Clara's hands were already closing around the shovel handle. Show me where. They worked like demons as the sun climbed higher and the wind began to pick up. Clara's world narrowed to the patch of ground in front of her, the bite of the shovel into earth, the desperate need to move faster, dig deeper, clear more ground before the flames reached them. Her back screamed in protest. Her hands blistered even through the gloves. Sweat soaked through her clothes despite the autumn temperature. Around her, the men worked with grim efficiency, Dawson setting a pace that seemed impossible to maintain. But they maintained it anyway, because the alternative was watching everything Dawson had built burn to ash. It was Clara who first noticed the change in the wind. Dawson, she screamed, pointing. The wind's shifting. He looked up, saw what she'd seen, and his face went white. The wind that had been blowing the fire away from the main pastures had reversed direction. In minutes, maybe less, those flames would be racing straight toward 300 head of cattle and the creek that was their only water source. We need to move the herd, Dawson shouted. Joe, Pete, mount up. We've got to push them south before they're trapped. What about the fire? Pete yelled back. The fire break will hold or it won't. Right now, those cattle matter more. Dawson turned to Clara, his eyes fierce with urgency. Can you keep digging? Just for another few minutes until we get the cattle moving? Every muscle in Clara's body was screaming for rest. Her hands were raw, her lungs burned with smoke. Exhaustion dragged at her like lead weights. But she nodded. Go, I'll hold the line. Dawson's hand cupped her face for just a moment, his touch achingly gentle despite the urgency of the situation. Be careful. If the fire jumps the break, you run. You hear me? You drop everything and you run. I hear you. Now go. He went, swinging up onto his horse and charging toward the distant herd with Joe and Pete flanking him. Clara turned back to her section of firebreak and dug with renewed desperation, because now she was alone with nothing but a shovel and determination standing between the flames and everything Dawson had spent 10 years building. The fire was close now, close enough that she could feel its heat on her face, could hear the terrible whisper roar of it, consuming grass and sage. Embers floated past her on the wind, little orange stars that died on the bare ground she'd created. But there were gaps in the firebreak, places where they hadn't had time to clear properly, and Clara threw herself at those weak points with something close to fury. She was dimly aware of shouting in the distance, the thunder of hooves as the men drove the cattle south. But most of her attention was fixed on the advancing flames, on the desperate question of whether her firebreak would be enough. The fire reached her cleared line and paused, as if testing this barrier of bare earth. For a moment, Clara dared to hope. Then an ember landed on a patch of grass they'd missed, caught, and flared to life behind the line. Clara didn't think. She just moved, attacking the new flame with her shovel, beating it back, smothering it with dirt. Another ember landed, then another, each one a potential disaster, each one demanding immediate attention. She was fighting the third spot fire when she heard hoofbeats behind her. "Clara!" Dawson's voice, raw with fear and something else. "Clara, get back!" She turned to find him racing toward her, his horse lathered with sweat. Behind him, a wall of flame at least 10 feet high was bearing down on her position, driven by wind that had turned from breeze to gale. Clara ran. She dropped the shovel and ran, her exhausted legs stumbling over the uneven ground. Behind her, she could hear the fire roaring like a living thing, could feel its heat reaching for her with greedy fingers. Dawson was off his horse before it fully stopped, grabbing Clara around the waist and hauling her up behind him. "Hold on!" he shouted, and kicked the horse into a gallop that nearly threw Clara from the saddle. She wrapped her arms around Dawson's waist and pressed her face against his back, feeling the powerful surge of the horse beneath them as they raced away from the inferno. They didn't stop until they reached the southern pasture where Joe and Pete had successfully driven the cattle. Only then did Dawson slow, his chest heaving with exertion and fear. He dismounted and reached up for Clara, his hands shaking as he lifted her down. "Don't ever," he said, his voice hoarse, "don't ever scare me like that again." Clara wanted to apologize, wanted to explain that she'd only been trying to help, but before she could speak, Dawson pulled her into his arms and held her with a fierceness that stole her breath. She could feel his heart hammering against her cheek, could feel the tremor in his hands as they pressed against her back. "I thought I was going to lose you," he said into her hair. "I thought I was going to watch you burn and not be able to reach you in time." Clara's arms came up around him, holding just as tightly. "I'm all right. I'm here. We're both all right." They stood like that for a long moment, while around them the cattle milled nervously, and Joe and Pete worked to keep them calm. Finally, Dawson pulled back, his hands moving to cup Clara's face as he studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're covered in soot," he said, his thumb brushing her cheek, "and your hands are bleeding through your gloves." "So are yours," Clara pointed out. A sound that might have been a laugh escaped Dawson's throat. "Fair point." He glanced back toward the north ridge where smoke still billowed into the sky. "We need to see how much damage was done. But first we need to get you cleaned up and those hands tended." "The ranch?" Clara started. "Can wait another hour," Dawson said firmly. "You're more important." The simple declaration sent warmth flooding through Clara's chest. She was important. Not just useful, not just convenient, but important. To this man, to this life they were building together. They rode back to the house double on Dawson's horse, Clara's arms around his waist, and her cheek resting against his back. The closeness felt different now, charged with something that hadn't been there before. Fear had burned away some barrier between them, left them raw and real with each other in a way that weeks of careful courtesy hadn't achieved. At the house, Dawson insisted on treating Clara's hands himself, his touch gentle as he cleaned the blisters and wrapped them in clean cloth. His own hands were just as bad, but he waved off her attempts to return the favor until she glared at him with enough force that he finally submitted. "You're stubborn," he said as she dabbed salve on his torn palms. "I learned from the best," Clara replied, and was rewarded with a genuine smile. It was the first time she'd seen him smile, really smile. Not just the polite upturn of lips, but a full expression of warmth that transformed his entire face. Clara's breath caught at the sight of it, at the glimpse of who Dawson might have been before grief carved away his lightness. "There," she said softly, finishing the bandaging. "Now we match." Dawson looked down at their wrapped hands, then back up at her, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement, perhaps, of how much had changed in the span of a morning, of how crisis had forged them into something more than two strangers bound by convenience. "Clara," Dawson said, his voice low, "I need to tell you something." But before he could continue, Joe came riding hard into the ranch yard, his face grim. "Boss," he called, "you need to see this." The fire had consumed nearly 50 acres of grassland before the firebreak finally held. The north pasture was scarred black, the fence line destroyed, and several of Dawson's best grazing areas reduced to ash and stubble. But the cattle were safe, the main ranch buildings untouched, and no one had been seriously injured. Standing at the edge of the burned ground, staring at the destruction, Clara felt rage building in her chest. This was deliberate. Someone had done this deliberately, had risked lives and livelihoods just to make a point. "We found where it started," Joe said, leading them to a spot near the creek. Someone piled dry brush and doused it with kerosene. Left the can behind, too. Didn't even try to hide it. Dawson picked up the can, his face like stone. "This came from Marbury's store. I recognized the label." "That's not proof he did it," Pete pointed out. "Could have been anyone who shops there." "It's proof enough for me," Dawson said quietly. "And it means things are about to get worse." He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, a series of small disasters plagued Hales Glen. Fence posts were cut in the middle of the night, allowing cattle to wander onto neighboring property where they had to be retrieved at considerable effort. The lock on the grain storage was broken, though nothing was actually stolen. Someone drove a wagon through Clara's carefully tended garden, destroying a month's worth of work in a single careless pass. Each incident was minor enough that involving the law seemed excessive. But taken together, they painted a clear picture. Someone wanted Dawson to break, wanted him desperate enough to sell that precious North pasture land. Clara watched Dawson grow quieter and grimmer with each new attack. He doubled the watch on the property, riding out at odd hours to check on things himself. He slept less, ate less, carried the weight of defending what was his like a physical burden. And through it all, Clara felt the secret of her pregnancy growing heavier inside her. She was certain now, the morning sickness, the exhaustion, the subtle changes in her body that no amount of denial could explain away. She was perhaps 10 weeks along, maybe 11. Soon it would start to show, and she'd have to tell Dawson. But how could she add that burden to everything else he was carrying? How could she ask him to face the terror of childbirth again when he was already fighting to save his ranch? The decision was taken out of her hands 3 weeks after the fire, when Clara woke before dawn and barely made it to the chamber pot before her stomach rebelled violently. She was still retching when she heard Dawson's footsteps in the hall, heard his knock on her door. "Clara, are you all right?" She wanted to lie, to send him away. But her body chose that moment to heave again, and there was no hiding what was happening. The door opened. Dawson took one look at her, at the chamber pot, at her pale face and shaking hands, and went very still. "How long?" he asked quietly. Clara wiped her mouth with a trembling hand. "I've suspected for a few weeks. I've been certain for about 10 days. Dawson moved to sit on the edge of her bed, his face unreadable. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you have enough to worry about," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I didn't want to add this to everything else. Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Dawson's voice was gentle now, concerned. "Afraid you'd be terrified," Clara admitted. "Afraid you'd see me and think of Anne. Afraid this would be the thing that finally broke you." Dawson was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took Clara's hand, mindful of her healing blisters. "I won't lie to you. The thought of going through childbirth again scares me more than anything else in this world. When Anne died, when I lost both of them, I thought I'd never survive that kind of pain again." Clara's heart clenched, tears stinging her eyes. "But," Dawson continued, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, "this is different. You're different. And maybe that makes me a fool, but I'm choosing to have faith that this time will be different too." He paused, then added softly, "We're going to get through this, Clara, together. I promise you that." The tears spilled over then, running down Clara's cheeks in hot tracks. Dawson pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried, his hand stroking her hair with infinite tenderness. "We'll get the best doctor," he murmured. "I'll write to Helena myself if I have to, bring back someone who knows what they're doing. We'll have months to prepare to make sure everything's ready. You're not going to die, Clara. I won't allow it." Despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the impossible weight of what lay ahead, Clara found herself laughing through her tears at the sheer stubbornness in his voice. As if he could simply forbid death from taking her, as if willpower alone could guarantee a safe delivery. But maybe that was what love looked like in this harsh country. Fierce determination in the face of terrible odds. The refusal to surrender even when surrender seemed inevitable. Love. The word stopped Clara cold. Was that what this was becoming? She cared for Dawson, respected him, felt safe with him. But love? That implied something deeper, something she wasn't sure either of them was ready for. And yet, as she sat there in his arms with dawn breaking outside her window and new life growing inside her, Clara couldn't deny the truth any longer. Somewhere between the day she arrived, terrified and alone, and this moment of shared vulnerability, she'd fallen in love with her quiet, grieving husband. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. "Dawson," she said softly, "we need to deal with Marbury, with what he's doing to the ranch, before the baby comes, before things get more complicated. We need to end this." Dawson pulled back to look at her. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop being defensive and start being smart," Clara said, her mind already working through possibilities. "Marbury's been careful not to leave evidence that would hold up in court, but he's also been arrogant, certain we won't fight back. Maybe it's time we use that arrogance against him." A slow smile spread across Dawson's face, the kind of smile that suggested he was seeing Clara in a new light. "What did you have in mind?" They spent the rest of that morning planning, Clara's nausea forgotten in the urgency of the task ahead. If Marbury wanted that north pasture badly enough to resort to intimidation and destruction, then there must be something about the railroad deal that gave him leverage or profit. Something worth investigating, something that might, if they were clever and lucky, provide exactly the ammunition they needed to stop him permanently. It was Pete who unknowingly provided the key piece of information. He came back from a supply run to Fort Kestrel with gossip from the general store. Marbury had been meeting regularly with railroad executives from back east, men in expensive suits who stayed at the best hotel and threw money around like it was water. The meetings were supposed to be secret, but nothing stayed secret in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. "They're planning to run the spur line through your north pasture, all right," Pete said, warming his hands around a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. "But here's the interesting part. Apparently the railroad's willing to pay 3 times what Marbury's been offering you. Word is he's planning to buy it cheap, then turn around and sell it to the railroad at full price, pocketing the difference for himself." Dawson's jaw tightened. "That's That's fraud," Clara interrupted, her mind racing. "Or at the very least, severe misrepresentation. If we could prove it, if we could show the railroad board what Marbury's actually doing, they'd cut him out of the deal entirely," Dawson finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. "They'd come to me directly, and Marbury would lose his commission and his credibility." "But how do we prove it?" Joe asked. "It's not like Marbury's going to confess." Clara stood up, pacing the kitchen with nervous energy. "We need documentation, letters, contracts, anything in writing that shows the true value of the land versus what Marbury's been offering. And we need testimony from someone who's seen those railroad executives who can confirm the meetings and what was discussed." "That's a tall order," Dawson said doubtfully. "Marbury keeps his business records locked up tighter than a bank vault." "Then maybe," Clara said slowly, an idea forming, "we need to make him think he's won, make him careless." Over the next week, they put Clara's plan into motion. Dawson let it be known around town that the constant harassment was wearing him down, that he was considering selling after all. He made a show of riding into Fort Kestrel to meet with Marbury, emerging from the bank looking defeated and exhausted. The performance was convincing because it wasn't entirely a performance. Dawson was exhausted, ground down by weeks of vigilance and worry. But now they were fighting back, and that made all the difference. While Dawson played his part, Clara began her own investigation. She befriended the wife of the hotel owner, a kind woman named Margaret who was delighted to have another educated woman to talk to. Over tea and sewing, Clara gently steered the conversation toward the railroad executives, listening carefully to Margaret's complaints about their demanding behavior and expensive tastes. "They've been here for weeks," Margaret confided, "meeting with Mr. Marbury almost daily. I shouldn't gossip, but I have to say, I don't care for the way they conduct business. All those papers and contracts spread out in the dining room, arguing about rotes and costs. It's unseemly." "I'm sure it's very complex," Clara said sympathetically. "Railroad business usually is. I remember my father dealing with shipping contracts. There were always so many documents to keep track of." "Oh, these men have documents for everything," Margaret agreed, "and they leave them lying about too. My cleaning girl's always having to straighten up after them. Just yesterday, she found a whole sheaf of papers they'd left in the dining room overnight. Survey maps, cost estimates, all sorts of official-looking things." Clara's heart began to race, but she kept her voice casual. "How careless. I hope nothing important went missing." "Oh no, we're very honest here. My girl put everything right back where she found it." Margaret leaned in conspiratorially. "Though between you and me, I did glance at the top page. Curiosity, you understand. It showed a land purchase offer for some property north of here. The amount was shocking. $20,000. Can you imagine?" 20,000. Dawson had told Clara that Marbury's best offer had been 7,000. The difference was staggering and exactly the proof they needed. "Shocking indeed," Clara managed, her mind already racing ahead to the next step. "Mrs. Wilson, I wonder if I might ask a favor." Getting into the hotel to examine those documents required careful timing and more than a little nerve. Margaret, bless her, had been horrified to learn about Marbury's scheme and was only too happy to help. She arranged for Clara to visit on an evening when the railroad men would be out at supper, giving her perhaps an hour to search the dining room where they conducted their business. Clara went alone, insisting that Dawson stay back at the ranch where his presence wouldn't be missed. Her hand shook as she sorted through the papers spread across the hotel's dining table, her eyes scanning contracts and correspondence by lamplight. There were survey maps showing the proposed rail line cutting directly through Dawson's north pasture. Cost estimates that valued the land at $20,000 for its strategic location and water access. And most damning of all, a letter from Marbury to the railroad president outlining his plan to acquire the property for a reasonable sum and transfer it to the railroad at a modest markup. A modest markup that amounted to $13,000 of pure profit. Clara's hands were steadier now as she carefully copied the most relevant passages into the small notebook she'd brought, making sure to record dates and signatures. She was so focused on her task that she didn't hear the footsteps in the hall until they were nearly at the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. If she was caught here, surrounded by documents she had no right to see, Marbury could have her arrested for theft or trespassing. She'd go to jail, and Dawson would lose both his wife and his case against Marbury. Clara shoved the notebook into her pocket and began hastily restacking the papers, trying to return them to their original arrangement. The footsteps were right outside now, accompanied by voices, men's voices, discussing something about grade percentages and elevation changes. The railroad executives were returning early. Clara looked around wildly for an escape route. The front door would take her right past them. The back door led through the kitchen, which was occupied by Margaret's cook preparing breakfast for the next morning. That left only one option: the window. Clara didn't let herself think about the impropriety or the danger. She simply lifted the sash as quietly as she could, hiked up her skirts, and climbed through just as the dining room door began to open. She dropped to the ground outside, landing hard enough to jar her teeth, and pressed herself flat against the building's exterior wall. Through the window she'd just escaped from, she could hear the railroad men entering the room, their voices carrying clearly in the evening air. "Marbury's getting nervous," one of them said. "He thinks Hale might not sell after all." "Then Marbury needs to apply more pressure," another voice replied, cold and businesslike. "We've invested too much in this route to let one stubborn rancher derail everything. If the harassment isn't working, perhaps it's time for more direct action." "You mean force him off the land?" "I mean use whatever means necessary to secure the right-of-way. Marbury has friends in the territorial government. A few well-placed words about disputed land claims or unpaid taxes, and Hale could find himself facing legal trouble he can't afford to fight." Clara's blood ran cold. This was worse than she'd thought. Marbury wasn't just a greedy banker. He was part of a conspiracy to defraud Dawson and potentially drive him from his land entirely. She waited until the voices moved away from the window, then slipped through the shadows back to where she'd left her horse tied behind the livery stable. Her hands were shaking again as she mounted, but this time it was with fury rather than fear. They had their proof, and now they were going to use it. Clara made it back to Hale's Glen well after dark, her clothes torn from her escape through the window and her heart still pounding with the close call. Dawson was waiting on the porch, and the relief on his face when he saw her ride in nearly undid Clara's composure. "You're all right?" he asked, helping her down from the horse. "I'm all right, and I've got what we need." Clara pulled the notebook from her pocket, its pages filled with carefully copied figures and damning correspondence. "Dawson, it's worse than we thought. They're planning to use legal pressure to force you off the land if the harassment doesn't work." Dawson's face went hard as granite as Clara recounted everything she'd overheard. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark valley that was his home. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "we ride to Fort Kestrel. We take these notes to the telegraph office, and we send them to the railroad's head office in Chicago. We expose exactly what Marbury's been doing." "And if it doesn't work?" Clara asked. "If they don't believe us, or if Marbury's connections protect him?" Dawson turned to her, and in the lamplight from the house, his eyes were fierce with determination. "Then we fight, in court, in the newspapers, any way we have to. But I'm not giving up my land, Clara. And I'm not letting Marbury intimidate us anymore. We end this, now." Clara nodded, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her stomach where their child grew. They had more to fight for now than just land and pride. They had a future to protect, a family to build, and whatever came next, they'd face it together. The storm that had been building since Clara's first day in Montana was finally about to break. But this time, Clara wasn't the frightened girl stepping off a stagecoach into an uncertain future. She was a woman who'd found her courage in the Montana wilderness, who'd learned to fight fires and stand up to bullies, and love a man who'd taught himself to hope again. Whatever tomorrow brought, they'd be ready. Dawn broke cold and clear over Hales Glen, the kind of crystalline November morning that promised winter wasn't far behind. Clara dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, the dark green wool that made her look respectable and serious despite the exhaustion shadowing her eyes. Her hands were steady as she pinned her hair, steadier than they'd been the night before when she'd climbed through that hotel window with stolen knowledge burning in her pocket. Dawson was already in the kitchen when she came down, 2 cups of coffee poured and waiting. He'd shaved and put on his Sunday clothes, the black coat and pressed shirt that made him look less like a rancher and more like the formidable man he was about to become. When he looked up at her, Clara saw the same fierce determination that had carried him through 10 years of building this ranch from nothing. "Ready?" he asked simply. Clara picked up her coffee, letting its warmth seep into her cold fingers. "Ready." They rode into Fort Kestrel side by side as the town was waking up, shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks and early risers heading to the bakery for fresh bread. Clara felt eyes tracking their progress down the main street, felt the weight of curiosity and speculation. By now, everyone knew about the trouble at Hales Glen. Small towns kept no secrets, especially when those secrets involved fire and fence cutting and the most powerful banker in the territory. The telegraph office occupied a narrow storefront between the general store and a saddlemaker's shop. Inside, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from his desk with the expression of someone unaccustomed to early morning visitors. "Help you folks?" he asked, his gaze sliding uncertainly between Dawson and Clara. "We need to send a telegram," Dawson said, placing Clara's notebook on the counter. "A long one. To Chicago." The telegraph operator's eyebrows rose. "Chicago? That'll cost you. I know what it'll cost." Dawson's voice was firm. "Just send it exactly as written, every word." Clara had spent half the night crafting the message, distilling pages of copied documents into terse telegraphic prose that still conveyed the essential truth that Silas Marbury was defrauding both the railroad and Dawson Hale, misrepresenting property values for personal profit, and conspiring to use legal pressure to force an unwilling sale. She'd included specific figures, dates, and references to documents she'd seen, making the accusation detailed enough that it couldn't be dismissed as mere rumor or spite. The operator read through Clara's careful handwriting, his expression growing more troubled with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Dawson with something like fear. "Mr. Hale, you understand that if I send this, Mr. Marbury will know about it within the hour? The telegraph clicks aren't exactly private, and he's got friends at every office between here and Chicago." "I'm counting on it," Dawson said. "Send it." The operator swallowed hard, then nodded. Your money, your message, but don't say I didn't warn you. The rhythmic clicking of the telegraph key followed them out into the street, each tap another word of accusation flying down the wire toward Chicago and toward Silas Marbury's carefully constructed empire. Clara felt her heart hammering in time with those clicks, knowing they'd just declared open war on the most powerful man in Fort Kestrel. We should go to the courthouse next, Clara said quietly. File a formal complaint with the territorial marshal. Create an official record before Marbury can spin this his own way. Dawson nodded, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that was becoming natural between them. You're sure you're up for this? With the baby and everything? The baby is fine, Clara said firmly. And I need to see this through. We both do. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building that served as the center of territorial government for the region. Inside, they found Marshal Thomas Garrett in his cramped office, reviewing a stack of wanted posters with the weary expression of a man who'd seen too much and expected too little. Hale, he said, looking up. Mrs. Hale. Wasn't expecting to see you two today. His eyes sharpened. This about the trouble at your ranch? It's about Silas Marbury, Dawson said, and proceeded to lay out the entire story while Clara added details and produced her notebook as evidence. Marshal Garrett listened in silence, his weathered face growing grimmer with each revelation. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. This is ugly, he said finally. Real ugly. But I'll be straight with you, Hale. Marbury's got powerful friends. His cousin's a territorial judge. His business partners include half the richest men between here and Helena. Even with evidence, getting a conviction will be near impossible. We're not asking for a conviction, Clara said, surprising both men with the steel in her voice. Not yet, anyway. We're asking for an official investigation, for someone in authority to acknowledge that these accusations exist and deserve scrutiny. Once that's on record, Marbury can't make this disappear quietly. The marshal studied Clara with new respect. You're a sharp one, aren't you? All right, I'll file the complaint and send a report to the territorial capital. Can't promise it'll go anywhere, but it'll be documented. That's something. It was more than something. It was ammunition, proof that they weren't going to be intimidated into silence. As they left the courthouse, Clara felt a grim satisfaction settling over her fear. They'd fired the first real shots in this battle, and now there was nothing to do but wait for Marbury's response. They didn't have to wait long. Dawson and Clara were halfway through a tense lunch at the hotel. Margaret Wilson had insisted they eat something before the long ride home, when Silas Marbury himself strode into the dining room with 2 men flanking him. One wore a marshal's badge from a neighboring county. The other was dressed in expensive Eastern clothes, his soft hands and calculating eyes marking him as a lawyer. Hale, Marbury said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. A word, if you please. Dawson stood slowly, positioning himself between Marbury and Clara. I've got nothing to say to you, Marbury. That's unfortunate because I have quite a bit to say to you. Marbury's smile was cold as January ice. I've just come from the telegraph office, where I learned you've sent some rather inflammatory accusations about me to parties in Chicago. Accusations that are not only false but legally actionable as slander and defamation. Not slander if it's true, Clara said, rising to stand beside Dawson. And we have documentation to prove every word. Marbury's gaze slid to her, and Clara saw naked contempt in his eyes. Documentation? You mean the notes you illegally copied while trespassing in a private dining room? That's theft, Mrs. Hale. And breaking and entering. Serious crimes, particularly for a woman in your delicate condition. Clara's hand instinctively moved to her stomach before she could stop herself. The gesture was small but telling, and Marbury's smile widened. Oh yes, I know about the baby. Small towns and their gossip, you understand. It would be a shame if you were arrested and had to spend your pregnancy in the territorial jail. Such poor conditions, such inadequate medical care. Why, a woman could lose a child under those circumstances. Or worse. Dawson moved before Clara could react, crossing the space between them in 2 strides and grabbing Marbury by the collar. You threatening my wife? The lawyer stepped forward quickly. Mr. Hale, I'd advise you to release Mr. Marbury immediately. Assault in front of witnesses, including a law enforcement officer, would give us ample grounds for your arrest. The marshal with the neighboring county badge nodded, his hand resting casually on his gun. "I'd listen to the lawyer, Hale. You're already in enough trouble." Clara's mind raced. This was a trap, she realized. Marbury had come here specifically to provoke Dawson into doing something stupid, something that would give them legal justification to arrest him and leave Clara alone and vulnerable. The hotel dining room was full of witnesses, all watching this confrontation with fascinated horror. "Dawson," Clara said quietly, "let him go." For a terrible moment, she thought he wouldn't listen. Dawson's jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping, his hand still fisted in Marbury's expensive coat. Then, with visible effort, he released his grip and stepped back. Marbury smoothed his lapels with exaggerated care. "How civilized of you. Now then, here's how this is going to work. You're going to send another telegram to Chicago, retracting your accusations and apologizing for the confusion. You're going to sign a contract selling me the North Pasture at my original offer, $7,000, I believe. And in exchange, I'll refrain from pressing charges against your wife for theft and trespassing." "And if we refuse?" Dawson asked, though Clara could hear the defeat creeping into his voice. "Then Mrs. Hale spends the night in jail," Marbury said pleasantly. "And given her condition and the stress of incarceration, well, these things have a way of working themselves out. Nature can be cruel to expectant mothers, especially those under duress." The threat was clear, and Clara felt ice settle in her veins. Marbury was threatening not just her freedom, but her unborn child, counting on Dawson's fear of losing another wife and another baby to force his capitulation. "You bastard," Dawson breathed. "I'm a businessman," Marbury corrected, "and I'm offering you a reasonable deal. Your land for your wife's freedom and safety. Surely that's not too high a price." Clara looked around the dining room at the assembled witnesses, at Margaret Wilson's horrified face and the other diners' averted eyes. No one was going to help them. No one was going to stand up to Marbury's power and influence. They were alone in this, trapped between impossible choices. Or were they? An idea struck Clara with the force of revelation. It was risky, possibly insane, but it was the only weapon they had left. The truth, spoken publicly where it couldn't be suppressed or ignored. "I'll make you a counteroffer, Mr. Marbury," Clara said, her voice ringing clear in the silent room. "You drop this farce, withdraw your threats, and leave our ranch alone. In exchange, I won't tell everyone in this room exactly what I found in those railroad documents." Marbury's eyes narrowed. "You already sent your little telegram. Whatever lies you want to spread have already been spread." "Oh, I'm not talking about the railroad," Clara said, watching him carefully. "I'm talking about the other papers I found. The ones showing that you've been embezzling from the bank for the past 3 years, falsifying loan records, pocketing interest payments, using depositors' money for your personal investments. That's why you need this railroad deal so desperately, isn't it? You're trying to cover your losses before the bank examiners discover what you've done." It was a complete fabrication. Clara had seen no such documents, had no proof of any embezzlement, but she'd learned enough about desperation in the past months to recognize it in others, and Marbury's sudden pallor told her the guess had struck home. "You're lying," Marbury said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Am I?" Clara pulled her notebook from her pocket, holding it up for the room to see. "Because I copied everything, Mr. Marbury, every figure, every discrepancy, every doctored ledger entry. And if anything happens to me or my husband or our child, these notes go straight to the Territorial Banking Commission. I've already made arrangements with Marshal Garrett to ensure that." It was another lie, but a believable one. Clara watched the calculation happening behind Marbury's eyes, watched him weighing the risks of calling her bluff against the catastrophic consequences if she was telling the truth. The silence stretched so long that Clara thought her heart would burst through her ribs. Then Marbury's lawyer leaned in and whispered something urgent in his ear. Whatever he said made Marbury's face go from pale to ashen. "This isn't over," Marbury said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You think you're clever, Mrs. Hale, but you've just made a powerful enemy. The railroad will take that land one way or another, and when they do, I'll make sure you regret every word of this conversation." "I'll take my chances," Clara said, though her legs were shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. Marbury turned on his heel and stalked out, his lawyer and the borrowed marshal following close behind. The moment they were gone, Clara's knees gave out entirely, and only Dawson's quick reflexes kept her from collapsing to the floor. "I've got you," he murmured, supporting her weight as he guided her back into her chair. "You're all right. Just breathe." Clara tried to follow his instructions, but her body seemed to have other ideas. Her vision was tunneling, her heart racing, nausea rising in a sickening wave. The stress of the confrontation, the terror of Marbury's threats, the desperate gamble she'd just taken, it was all crashing down on her at once. "The baby," she gasped. "Dawson, the baby!" "Is going to be fine," Dawson said with fierce certainty, though Clara could hear the fear underneath. "Margaret, we need a room, now, and send someone for the doctor." The next hours passed in a haze of pain and fear. Clara's body had decided that the stress was too much, that the pregnancy couldn't be sustained, and nothing the harried doctor could do seemed able to stop the cramping and bleeding that threatened to end everything before it had truly begun. Clara drifted in and out of awareness, registering Dawson's presence as a constant anchor. His hand holding hers, his voice murmuring reassurances she couldn't quite make out, his face drawn with the same terror he must have felt watching Anne die. She wanted to tell him she was sorry, that she should never have confronted Marbury, should never have taken such risks with their child's life. But the words wouldn't come, lost in waves of pain that stole her breath and her ability to think. Sometime deep in the night, when the world had narrowed to just pain and darkness and the desperate need to hold on, Clara heard the doctor speaking in low tones. "The bleeding's slowing. I think we might be past the worst of it." "Is she going to lose the baby?" Dawson's voice was hoarse, ravaged. "I can't say for certain. The next 24 hours will tell. But if she can rest, stay calm, avoid any stress." The doctor trailed off, the impossibility of that prescription hanging in the air. How could Clara possibly avoid stress when they were in the middle of a war with Silas Marbury? When their ranch and their future hung in the balance? When everything they'd built together threatened to crumble around them? But her body made the decision for her, dragging her down into exhausted sleep despite her fears. When she woke, pale winter sunlight was streaming through the hotel room window, and Dawson was slumped in a chair beside the bed, his head pillowed on his arms at her side. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. "Dawson?" Clara whispered, her throat dry as dust. He jerked awake immediately, his eyes focusing on her with desperate intensity. "Clara, how do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses," she admitted, "but alive." "Is the baby—" "Still there, according to the doctor. He examined you an hour ago while you were sleeping, says there's reason for hope." Dawson's hand found hers, gripping tight enough to hurt. "Clara, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I should never have let you come to town, should never have put you in a position where Marbury could threaten you." "Stop," Clara interrupted. "This isn't your fault. It's Marbury's and the railroads, and a system that lets powerful men crush anyone who stands in their way, but it's not yours and it's not mine either. We did what we had to do." "You could have died," Dawson said roughly. "You could have lost the baby, and for what? A piece of land?" "For our home," Clara corrected gently. "For our future. For the principle that we don't let bullies win just because they're powerful." She paused, then added softly, "And because I love you, Dawson Hale. Because somewhere along the way, this arrangement stopped being about convenience and started being about building a life together. A real life, worth fighting for." Dawson stared at her, his expression caught somewhere between wonder and anguish. "You love me?" "I do," Clara said simply. "I know it's probably foolish and poor timing, and—" He kissed her, stopping the words with a tenderness that made her chest ache. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you too," he said. "I think I started falling the moment you stood in that burned garden and said you wanted to bring it back. You're the bravest person I've ever met, Clara, and the kindest, and I don't deserve you, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to." Clara's own tears spilled over, running hot down her cheeks. "We deserve each other," she said. "The scared widow and the desperate mail-order bride. We found each other when we both needed it most." They stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads pressed together, breathing the same air. Then a knock at the door made them both startle. "It's Marshal Garrett," a gruff voice called. Need to speak with you folks. Dawson helped Clara sit up, propping pillows behind her back before opening the door. The marshal stepped inside, his hat in his hands and his expression grim. "How's she doing?" he asked, nodding toward Clara. "Better," Dawson said. "What's happened?" "Got a response from Chicago," Garrett said. "The railroad board sent an investigator on the first train west. He'll be here in 3 days with authority to examine Marbury's books and conduct a full audit of the deal." He paused, a small smile crossing his weathered face. "Seems your telegram struck a nerve. The railroad takes fraud seriously, especially when it threatens a major expansion project." Clara felt hope rising in her chest for the first time since the confrontation. "So they believed us?" "They believe enough to investigate," Garrett said, "and Marbury knows it. Word is he's been burning papers in his office fireplace all morning. But here's the thing, the railroad investigator's going to need your testimony, Mrs. Hale. Your notes, your statement about what you saw, everything. Without that, Marbury might still wiggle free." "She'll testify," Dawson said immediately. "Whatever they need. In 3 days," Garrett warned. "Can she travel by then?" "Doctor said she needs rest." "I'll manage," Clara said firmly. "Dawson, help me up. We need to get home, prepare properly for what's coming." The ride back to Hales Glen was slow and careful, Dawson insisting they stop frequently so Clara could rest. By the time they reached the ranch, twilight was painting the valley in shades of purple and gold, and Clara had never been so grateful to see home in her life. Joe and Pete met them at the house, their faces tight with worry that eased slightly when they saw Clara was all right. Over supper, a simple stew that Joe had made, bless him, Dawson filled them in on everything that had happened. "So we wait," Pete said when he finished. "Wait for this investigator to show up and hope he's honest." "We do more than wait," Dawson said. "We prepare. Clara's testimony needs to be rock solid, which means we need to organize her notes, create a clear timeline, gather any corroborating evidence we can find." They spent the next 2 days doing exactly that. Clara, confined to bed rest by Dawson's worried insistence, worked from a nest of pillows and blankets, transcribing her hasty notes into a coherent narrative. Dawson rode into town to collect testimony from Margaret Wilson about the railroad executive's stay at her hotel. Even Joe and Pete contributed, documenting every incident of harassment and sabotage they'd witnessed or heard about. By the time the railroad investigator arrived, they had assembled a case file thick enough to choke a horse. The investigator was a sharp-eyed man named Theodore Walsh, who carried himself with the careful neutrality of someone who'd seen every kind of fraud and corruption the West had to offer. He spent 2 days in Fort Kestrel, examining bank records, interviewing witnesses, and comparing Marbury's representations to the railroad against the actual terms of his proposed purchase from Dawson. On the 3rd day, he requested a formal hearing at the courthouse, with all parties present. Clara dressed carefully that morning, choosing her most respectable dress and pinning her hair with shaking hands. The baby had quieted after those terrifying hours at the hotel, but she could still feel the fragility of the pregnancy, the sense that everything could still go wrong. "You don't have to do this," Dawson said, watching her from the doorway. "I can testify. Walsh can read your notes." "I'm doing this," Clara said firmly. "Marbury threatened our child, Dawson. Threatened to take everything we've built. I'm not letting him hide behind lawyers and influence while someone else fights our battle." The courthouse was packed when they arrived, every seat filled with townspeople eager to witness the showdown between Silas Marbury and the couple who dared challenge him. Clara felt the weight of their stares as Dawson guided her to a seat at the front, his hand protective at her elbow. Marbury sat across the aisle with 3 lawyers surrounding him, his expression carved from stone. When his eyes met Clara's, she saw pure hatred there, and a promise that whatever happened today, he would make them pay. But Clara had survived fire and threats, and the terror of nearly losing her child. Silas Marbury's hatred was just one more thing to endure. Walsh called the hearing to order and began methodically presenting his findings. He discovered that Marbury had misrepresented the railroad's offer by more than 60%. He'd found evidence of pressure tactics and harassment. He'd documented meetings where Marbury had explicitly discussed ways to force Dawson off his land. And then Walsh did something unexpected. He produced a ledger from the Fort Kestrel Bank showing systematic discrepancies in loan interest calculations, money that had been skimmed off deposits and redirected to Marbury's personal accounts. Clara's fabricated accusation had been true after all. Marbury had been embezzling, and Walsh had found the proof. The courthouse erupted in shocked murmurs. Marbury's lawyers went into hurried consultation, their earlier confidence crumbling, and Silas Marbury himself sat frozen, watching his empire collapse around him. Based on these findings, Walsh announced, the Railroad Corporation is severing all business relationships with Mr. Marbury and will be referring criminal charges to the territorial prosecutor. Furthermore, we will be approaching Mr. Hale directly regarding fair compensation for a right-of-way easement across his property. An easement, not a purchase, allowing Mr. Hale to retain ownership while permitting railroad access. It was more than they'd hoped for, better than they dared imagine. Clara felt Dawson's hand find hers, squeezing tight as the reality sank in. They'd won. Against all odds, against power and influence and threats, they'd actually won. But victory came with a price. That night, as Clara lay in bed at the hotel, Dawson had insisted they stay in town until Walsh's business was concluded. She felt the cramping begin again. Stronger this time, more insistent, accompanied by a rush of fluid that made her cry out in fear. "Dawson!" she called, her voice breaking. "Something's wrong!" He was there instantly, and then the doctor, and then nothing but pain and terror and the desperate prayer that she wouldn't lose this baby now, not when they'd fought so hard to protect it. The labor came too early, nearly 6 weeks too early, but once it started, there was no stopping it. Clara pushed and screamed and begged for it to be over while Dawson held her hand and the doctor worked with grim determination. Outside, a winter storm had rolled in, thunder shaking the windows and rain hammering the roof in a deluge that matched the chaos of birth. Clara was distantly aware of Dawson's voice breaking as he pleaded with her to hold on, to keep fighting, to not leave him alone again. "I'm not leaving," she gasped between contractions. "Not today. Not ever." It was a promise she intended to keep, even as her body threatened to break that vow with every agonizing push. The pain was beyond anything Clara had imagined, beyond anything she thought she could survive. But she'd survived fire and threats, and nearly losing everything that mattered. She could survive this too. She had to, for Dawson, for their child, for the life they'd built from nothing but hope and desperation and love that had bloomed in the Montana wilderness. "One more push," the doctor urged. "Come on, Mrs. Hale. One more." Clara gathered every remaining scrap of strength and pushed with everything she had. Thunder crashed overhead, and in that moment, between one breath and the next, between agony and relief, their son entered the world with a cry that cut through the storm like a knife. "He's alive," the doctor said, and Clara heard the relief in his voice. Small but breathing, strong lungs on him. Dawson was crying, she realized, silent tears streaming down his face as the doctor cleaned their son and wrapped him in blankets. When he placed the baby in Clara's arms, so tiny, so perfect, with dark hair and Dawson's strong chin, Clara felt her heart crack open with a love so fierce it bordered on pain. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Welcome to Montana." Dawson leaned over them both, his hand gentle on their son's head, his eyes full of wonder and terror and relief so profound it had left him speechless. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside this small hotel room, everything had gone suddenly, perfectly still. They'd made it. Against impossible odds, against threats and fire and loss, they'd brought new life into the world. Their son, their future, the beginning of everything they'd fought so hard to protect. Clara looked up at Dawson, saw her own amazement reflected in his face, and smiled through her exhaustion. "We did it," she said simply. Dawson's answer was to kiss her forehead, then the baby's, his tears falling freely now. "You did it. You're incredible. Both of you are incredible." The doctor finished his work and quietly excused himself, leaving the new family alone in the lamplight. Outside, the storm began to ease, thunder fading to a distant rumble as the rain settled into a steady, gentle patter. Clara held their son close, feeling his tiny heartbeat against her chest, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Philadelphia to Fort Kestrel, from terrified mail-order bride to fierce defender of home and family, from stranger to partner to wife to mother. It hadn't been the life she'd imagined, but it was the life she'd chosen, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. The baby's name was Thomas, after Dawson's father, and he was the smallest, most perfect thing Clara had ever seen. In those first fragile days after his birth, she barely let him out of her sight, watching the rise and fall of his tiny chest with a vigilance born of terror and love. The doctor had warned them that early babies sometimes struggled, that the next few weeks would be critical, but Thomas seemed determined to prove everyone's fears unfounded. He nursed hungrily, cried with impressive volume, and gripped Clara's finger with a strength that belied his size. Dawson was transformed by fatherhood in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. The quiet, reserved man she'd married had cracked open like an egg, spilling tenderness and wonder everywhere. He'd sit for hours just watching Thomas sleep, his weathered finger tracing the baby's tiny features with reverent care. At night, when Thomas fussed, Dawson would walk the hotel room floor with his son cradled against his chest, humming old songs Clara had never heard him sing before. "I forgot," he said one night, his voice thick with emotion as he held their sleeping son. "I'd forgotten what this felt like. The hope of it. The terrifying, wonderful hope." Clara understood. After Anne's death, Dawson had locked away that part of himself that could imagine a future beyond grief. But Thomas had broken down those walls, forcing life and light back into spaces that had been dark too long. They stayed in Fort Kestrel for 2 weeks, giving Clara time to recover and Thomas time to grow stronger before attempting the journey home. During that time, the aftermath of Silas Marbury's downfall played out with a swiftness that shocked even those who'd witnessed his crimes firsthand. The territorial prosecutor filed charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The bank board, horrified by the extent of Marbury's theft, immediately removed him from all positions of authority. His cousin the judge, desperate to distance himself from the scandal, recused himself from any related cases, and the railroad, eager to salvage their reputation, offered Dawson a settlement so generous it took his breath away. $25,000, Dawson said, reading the contract Theodore Walsh had delivered to their hotel room. "For a 20-year easement across the North Pasture. They'll build and maintain their own crossings, pay for any cattle losses caused by trains, and I retain full ownership of the land." Clara, propped up in bed with Thomas nursing at her breast, felt tears prick her eyes. That money represented security beyond anything they dared imagine. It meant hired hands so Dawson wouldn't work himself to death. It meant a larger house with room for more children. It meant Thomas would grow up with opportunities his parents had never had. "Take it," she said. "It's more than fair. It's generous." Dawson signed the contract that afternoon, and Walsh promised to have the first payment delivered within the month. As he was leaving, the investigator paused in the doorway, his sharp eyes softening as they landed on the baby. "Your wife's testimony was the key to everything, Mr. Hale," he said. "Her courage, her careful documentation. The railroad board wanted me to convey their respect and gratitude." He smiled slightly. "Between you and me, there aren't many who'd stand up to someone like Marbury. You're lucky to have her." "Don't I know it?" Dawson said, his hand finding Clara's shoulder. The journey back to Hale's Glen was slow and careful. Thomas bundled in so many blankets he looked like a small, squirming cocoon. Joe and Pete met them halfway with fresh horses and provisions, their gruff faces breaking into genuine smiles when Dawson pulled back the blankets to show them the baby. "He's tiny," Joe said, sounding almost accusatory, as if Thomas's size was a personal affront. "He'll grow," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. "Give him time." The ranch looked different when they finally crested the last hill and saw the valley spread below them. Or maybe Clara was different, seeing it now through a mother's eyes. This was Thomas's inheritance, this wild, beautiful place. These mountains, this creek, this house, where hopefully many more children would be born and raised. Dawson had ridden ahead to light fires and air out the house, and when Clara carried Thomas through the front door, warmth and light greeted them. But something else, too. The nursery door at the top of the stairs stood open for the first time since Anne's death. Clara climbed slowly, Thomas in her arms, and found Dawson standing in the doorway of that sealed room. He'd been crying, she realized. His eyes were red, his face wet with tears he hadn't bothered to hide. "I opened it," he said simply. "I thought it was time." Clara moved to stand beside him, looking into a room that was clearly meant for a child. A beautiful handmade cradle sat near the window, sunlight streaming across its polished wood. Shelves waited empty for toys and books. A rocking chair faced the light, positioned perfectly for nursing and storytelling. "Anne and I built all this," Dawson said quietly. "Every piece. We were so sure, so certain that our baby would sleep in that cradle, that we'd fill those shelves, that we'd rock our child in that chair." His voice broke. "And then she died. And I couldn't even look at this room without wanting to die too. So I locked it away. Pretended it didn't exist." Clara shifted Thomas to one arm and took Dawson's hand with the other. "And now? Now I think maybe Anne would want this room used for its purpose, would want Thomas to sleep here, to grow here." Dawson turned to her, his gray eyes shining with tears and hope. "Would that be all right with you? I know some women want the baby close." "I think it's perfect," Clara said, her own tears starting. "I think it's exactly right." They spent that afternoon making the nursery truly theirs. Clara lined the cradle with fresh blankets while Dawson cleaned the windows until they sparkled. Together they hung curtains Clara had sewn during her early days at the ranch, back when she'd been too afraid to ask what they were for. The rocking chair creaked gently when Clara tested it, Thomas cradled against her chest, and the sound felt like a benediction. This room had been built with love and lost in tragedy. But now it was being reclaimed, filled with new life and new hope. Anne's memory would always be part of these walls, but so would Clara's presence and Thomas's future. That night, after Thomas was settled in his cradle and the house had gone quiet, Clara and Dawson lay together in what had finally become their shared bed. The transition had happened naturally in the weeks after Thomas's birth, neither of them able to bear sleeping apart when every moment felt precious and precarious. "Tell me about Anne," Clara said into the darkness. "Really tell me. Not just the sad parts, but who she was." Dawson was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. Then he began to speak, his voice soft in the darkness. "She laughed at everything. That's what I remember most. She'd find joy in the smallest things, a bird at the window, bread rising perfectly, the way snow looked on the mountains. She was always cold, even in summer, so I'd find her wearing 3 shawls and standing near the stove." His voice grew tender with memory. "She tried so hard to love this place, Clara. Tried to make it work, even though she was lonely and scared and homesick. She never complained, never asked me to give up the ranch and move back to town. She just tried." "She sounds wonderful," Clara said honestly. "She was, but she wasn't you." Dawson rolled to face Clara, his hand cupping her cheek. "You're stronger than Anne ever was, braver. You don't just try to adapt to this life, you grab it with both hands and make it yours. You fought fires, stood up to Marbury, nearly died bringing Thomas into the world, and never once did you ask for an easier path." "I was terrified the entire time," Clara admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway." Dawson's thumb brushed her cheekbone. "I love you, Clara Hale. Not as a replacement for what I lost, but as exactly who you are. The woman who came here desperate and turned herself into someone formidable." Clara kissed him then, pouring 3 months of love and fear and hope into the contact. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, she pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "I love you too, even though you pick terrible wildflowers and can't cook to save your life." Dawson's laugh was surprised and genuine. "The wildflowers weren't that bad." "They were weeds, Dawson. Beautiful weeds, but weeds." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and for the first time since Clara had arrived in Montana, the house at Hales Glen didn't feel empty at all. Winter settled over the valley with the inexorable certainty of mountains and sky. Snow came in November and stayed, transforming the landscape into something alien and beautiful. Clara had never experienced a real winter before. Philadelphia's cold was nothing compared to Montana's brutal temperatures and endless white, but she found herself falling in love with the season's stark beauty. Thomas thrived despite the cold, growing plumper and stronger with each passing week. By December, he'd outgrown his first set of clothes and was working on his second. His dark hair had come in thick, and his eyes, which had started the slate blue of all newborns, were settling into the same gray as his father's. "He's going to be handsome," Clara said one morning, watching Dawson hold their son up to the window to see the icicles hanging from the eaves. "And stubborn. Look at that chin." "He gets the stubbornness from you," Dawson said without looking away from Thomas, who was making enthusiastic, if incomprehensible, noises at the ice. "I'm not stubborn, I'm determined. You're the most stubborn woman in Montana Territory, and I wouldn't change a thing about you." The railroad money arrived as promised, deposited in a Helena bank under both their names. With it came a freedom neither of them had known before. Dawson hired 2 more ranch hands, easing the workload that had been slowly killing him. They ordered supplies from a catalog thick as a Bible: warm clothes for the family, tools for the ranch, toys for Thomas that he wouldn't be old enough to play with for years. Clara spent part of the money on something she'd been dreaming about since the first time she'd tackled that garden: seeds. Hundreds of packets of seeds, carefully selected from a supplier in California. Come spring, she was going to transform that reclaimed plot into something magnificent. But winter had its own work. Clara learned to churn butter and make cheese, to preserve meat in the cold cellar, and bake bread that could feed a house full of hungry men. She learned to card wool from the sheep Dawson had bought with the railroad money, and began teaching herself to spin. The work was endless, but it was satisfying in ways her Philadelphia life had never been. In the evenings, after Thomas was asleep and the chores were done, Clara and Dawson would sit by the fire and make plans. Plans for the ranch, for the house, for the family they were building. Sometimes Joe and Pete would join them, the 4 of them playing cards or sharing stories late into the night. It was during one of those evenings that a knock came at the door, unexpected and jarring in the winter silence. Dawson answered it to find Marshall Garrett standing on the porch, snow dusting his shoulders. "Bit late for a social call, Marshall," Dawson said, but he stepped back to let the lawman inside. Garrett stomped snow from his boots and removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Clara. "Sorry to disturb your evening, folks, but I thought you'd want to hear this in person rather than through town gossip." Clara's stomach clenched with sudden fear. "What's happened?" "Silas Marbury," Garrett said heavily. "He was convicted this afternoon. 15 years in territorial prison for fraud and embezzlement. They're transferring him to the penitentiary in Deer Lodge next week." The news should have felt like victory. Instead, Clara just felt tired. Tired of fighting, tired of fear, tired of carrying the weight of what Marbury had tried to do to them. "Good," Dawson said simply. "He deserves worse, but it's something." "There's more," Garrett continued. Before sentencing, Marbury made a statement, said a lot of things about corruption and power, most of it bitter nonsense, but he also said something I thought you should know. The marshal's eyes found Clara's. "He said your courage shamed him, that watching you stand up to him when half the men in the territory were too scared to cross him made him realize how far he'd fallen." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She'd never wanted to shame Marbury, had only wanted to protect her family and her home. "I don't think it makes what he did any better," she said finally. "But I hope he finds some kind of redemption in prison. I hope he becomes a better man." After Garrett left, Dawson pulled Clara into his arms and just held her, his chin resting on top of her head. "You're too good," he murmured. "Most people would want Marbury to rot. I'm not most people, and holding on to anger only hurts the person doing the holding." Clara pulled back to look up at him. "We won, Dawson. We get to move forward. I won't poison that by wishing more suffering on a man who's already lost everything." Christmas came quietly to Hales Glen, marked by a small tree Dawson cut from the forest and dragged home through the snow. Clara decorated it with paper ornaments and strings of popcorn, and on Christmas morning they sat together as a family, Thomas propped between them, and marveled at how much had changed since Clara had first stepped off that stagecoach. "A year ago I was alone," Dawson said, his hand resting on Thomas's small back, "convinced I'd always be alone, that I'd never feel anything but empty again." "A year ago, I was terrified," Clara added, "certain I'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd never belong here." "And now?" Clara looked around the warm house, at the decorated tree, and the cradle by the fire where Thomas would nap later. She looked at Joe and Pete, who joined them for Christmas dinner. at the snow falling softly outside the windows, at Dawson's face transformed by love and hope. "Now I'm home," she said simply. Finally, completely home. Spring came late to Montana, winter clinging to the valley with stubborn determination. But when it finally released its grip, the transformation was breathtaking. Snowmelt swelled the creek to a roar, wildflowers carpeted the meadows in impossible colors, and Clara's garden exploded with life. She worked the plot every morning while Thomas napped in a basket nearby, Joe or Pete always close enough to help if she needed it. The seeds she'd ordered grew with enthusiastic vigor in the rich soil, and by June, Clara was harvesting vegetables faster than the household could eat them. "We need to trade with the neighbors," she announced at dinner one evening, surveying the pile of produce on the table. "Otherwise, this is all going to go to waste." "What neighbors?" Dawson asked, amused. "The nearest ranch is 5 miles away." "Then I guess we'll be taking a lot of rides," Clara said firmly. "I didn't work this hard to let good food rot." She was right, of course. Over the summer, Clara established a trading network with the scattered ranches and families within a day's ride of Hales Glen. Vegetables for butter, herbs for honey, eggs for fresh milk. She became known throughout the region as the woman who could grow anything, who'd come from Philadelphia and somehow mastered Montana's short growing season through sheer determination. Thomas celebrated his first birthday in August with a cake Clara had baked, and enough presents to spoil him thoroughly. He was walking now, tottering around the house with the confidence of a small drunk person, getting into everything and charming everyone he encountered. His first word had been "da," much to Dawson's delight and Clara's mock outrage. "I'm the one who feeds you," she'd said to Thomas, who just laughed and said "da" again. In September, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the knowledge came without fear, accompanied instead by a calm certainty that everything would be fine. She told Dawson while they were working in the garden together, Thomas playing in the dirt nearby. "Already?" Dawson said, his eyes going wide. "Thomas is barely a year old." "I know when it happened," Clara said with a meaningful look, and watched her husband's ears turn red. "Right. Well, that's wonderful, Clara. Are you happy?" "I'm happy," she confirmed, and meant it. Terrified, but happy. That seems to be my natural state these days. The second pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Clara knew what to expect, perhaps because there was no Silas Marbury threatening everything she held dear. Her body knew what to do this time, and the baby, another boy, born in late spring, arrived with far less drama than Thomas had managed. They named him William, after Clara's father, and he was the opposite of his brother in every way. Where Thomas had been small and fierce, William was placid and enormous. Where Thomas had nursed frantically, William was patient. Where Thomas had cried at everything, William seemed content to simply observe the world with solemn, thoughtful eyes. "2 sons," Dawson said, holding William while Thomas climbed over his legs demanding attention. "I'm the luckiest man in Montana." "You're the most exhausted man in Montana," Clara corrected, but she was smiling. "And we're not done yet. I want at least 4 children, Dawson Hale. This ranch needs filling up." Dawson's answering smile was tired, but genuine. "Whatever you want, my love, though maybe we can space them out a bit more than 13 months next time." They had their 3rd child, a daughter, 18 months later. And their 4th, another daughter, 2 years after that. The house expanded with them, Dawson and the ranch hands building on new rooms as the family grew. The nursery that had once been sealed in grief became a room of laughter and chaos, children piling into the big bed to hear stories before sleep. Clara never did get used to the Montana winters, but she learned to love the other seasons with a fierce passion. Spring meant the garden coming back to life. Summer meant long days of work and growth. Fall meant harvest and preparation, the satisfaction of shelves lined with preserved food, and the knowledge that they'd survive another winter. The ranch prospered with the railroad easement money and Dawson's careful management. They added more cattle, bought better horses, built new outbuildings. Joe and Pete stayed on, growing older and grayer but no less essential to the operation. Eventually, Pete married a widow from Fort Kestrel and brought her to live in a small house Dawson built on the southern edge of the property. Clara became a fixture in the territory, known as much for her fierce protection of her family as for her legendary garden. She served on the school board when Fort Kestrel finally got a proper schoolhouse, and she never backed down from an argument she believed in. People learned quickly not to underestimate the quiet woman who'd once stood up to Silas Marbury. The years rolled past like water over stones, each one polishing away rough edges and revealing the solid foundation beneath. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved the cattle and the land as much as his father did. William became the scholar of the family, constantly reading and asking questions that made even the adults think. The girls, Emma and Sarah, were wild creatures who rode horses bareback and could outwork most of the ranch hands by the time they were 10. And through it all, Clara and Dawson grew deeper into their love, the desperate beginning mellowing into something steady and sure. They still had their quiet evenings on the porch, still worked side by side in the garden, still held each other through the long winter nights when the wind howled and the snow piled high. One evening, when Thomas was 15 and William 13, and the girls were still young enough to chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Clara and Dawson sat on that same porch where they'd shared so many moments. "Tell us the story again, Mama," Emma called, running up the steps with Sarah close behind. "About how you came here." It was a story they'd heard 100 times, but they never tired of it. Clara looked at Dawson, saw him smile and nod, and began. "I came to Montana in 1876, she said, gathering Sarah into her lap while Emma leaned against Dawson's knee. "On a stagecoach that seemed to go on forever, to marry a man I'd never met. I was so scared I could barely breathe." "But you came anyway," Emma said, knowing her part in this familiar litany. "I came anyway, and when I got here I found your father waiting. I'd been told he might be cruel, that he was cold and empty and wouldn't be kind to me." "But he picked you flowers," Sarah added, and Clara could hear Thomas and William pausing in their play to listen, drawn in despite their teenage conviction that they were too old for such stories. "He did pick me flowers. Terrible flowers, actually, mostly weeds, but the gesture was kind." Clara reached over and took Dawson's hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "And he said something that first day that I've never forgotten." "What did he say?" the girls chorused, though they knew the answer by heart. Clara looked at Dawson, saw the love and pride and contentment in his eyes, and recited the words that had defined their life together. "He said, 'Let's get you home before the storm hits.' And I thought he was just talking about the weather, but I think now he was talking about something bigger. About finding home, about building shelter together, about weathering all the storms life would throw at us." "Did you weather them?" Emma asked, still caught in the story despite knowing how it ended. "Every single one," Dawson answered, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mother is the bravest person I've ever known. She came here with nothing but courage and hope, and she built all of this with her own 2 hands. We built it together," Clara corrected gently. "That's the real story. Not about a scared girl or a grieving man, but about 2 people who found each other when they needed it most and chose to build something beautiful." The children drifted away eventually, back to their games and their own young lives. But Clara and Dawson stayed on the porch as the sun set over their valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose. "Do you ever regret it?" Dawson asked quietly. "Answering that advertisement? Coming all this way?" Clara thought about the girl she'd been, desperate and terrified, gambling everything on a stranger's promise. She thought about the woman she'd become, strong and sure and surrounded by love. She thought about the children playing in the yard, the garden that would bloom again come spring, the ranch that had grown from Dawson's dream into their shared legacy. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You told me that first day that you didn't need a servant, that you needed someone who would stay. Well, I stayed, Dawson, and I always will." "You did more than stay," Dawson said, pulling her close. "You brought this place back to life. You brought me back to life." "We saved each other," Clara said simply. "That's what love does." They sat together as darkness fell and the first stars appeared, as they had hundreds of times before, and would hundreds of times again. The house behind them glowed with lamplight and life, filled with the sound of children's laughter and the promise of tomorrow. Clara Hale, who'd once been Clara Whitfield from Philadelphia, who'd traveled west as a mail-order bride expecting cruelty and finding love instead, rested her head on her husband's shoulder, and smiled. The journey had been hard. The risks had been real. The fear had been constant. But every moment of struggle had led to this: a summer evening in Montana, surrounded by family, secure in love, certain of her place in the world. She'd come to this valley with nothing but desperate hope and had found everything she'd never dared to dream of. Home, family, purpose, love that had transformed them both. And as the last light faded from the sky and Dawson's arm tightened around her waist, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she'd choose this life again and again, through every storm, through every challenge, through every beautiful, terrible, wonderful moment. Because some journeys, no matter how frightening they start, lead exactly where they're meant to go. And Clara Hale was finally, completely, eternally home.